One thing is for certain these days, and that's that Marvel Studios is not where they were before, especially when it comes to the end of Phase 1 all the way to the end of Phase 3. So let's talk about how the MCU was a cultural movement built on hype that obviously elevated it to the mainstream. So not too long ago, I released this video talking about how there was a whole entire cult of personality built around the DCEU being a counteractive and counter movement to the MCU. Everything I said in that video still stands. So this is a video that's sort of a counter to that to talk about the many aspects that some of you in the comments brought up saying, wait, the MCU was also a cultural movement that's also not seeing the heights that were set by the previous phases. And I agree with you, so I'm making this video. So let's get to how the MCU was a cultural movement elevated by hype. So for this, we are going to need to look at a chart, and this will sort of be a great guide for what I'm talking about here. So looking at this, if we look at what's going on with Phase 1, starting with Iron Man 1 and Iron Man 2, those are the actual profitable films. If you look at the other films here, you're looking at The Incredible Hulk, The First Avenger, and Thor. Those were barely profitable, making essentially pocket change. But look at what happens with the Avengers, right? Look at that. 1.5 billion. This is what I say when I say cultural movement. I talked about this on old podcasts, and when we talked about this, I remember this film got so much hype and it became such a thing that the Best Buy I was working at the time as the game division manager, they literally closed down the store early one night and bought everybody tickets so we could go see it. That's how big of a cultural movement it was. Most of the people didn't even know what it was. They just want to see it because it was all the buzz. And look at it. 1.5 billion. It changed the world and it changed Hollywood forever. This singular movie spawned the craze for a shared universe. And then look at the pattern after. You have Iron Man 3. Obviously, it makes double what the previous two Iron Man films did. And then look at the pattern across the board. The Avengers films are always topping the charts, but look at some of these other characters that are part of this cultural movement. Black Panther and Civil War. Both films which essentially boil down to, well, one is mini Avengers, the other one, that's Black Panther, a African-American lead for the first time ever in a giant blockbuster of this size in a mega franchise this big, building up the next Avengers. Yeah, people wanted to get in. And then look at Spider-Man No Way Home. Again, that one all the way at the end shows us the whole hype cycle and how playing on nostalgia and the hype of previous builds delivers, right? Now, there are three very low ones there. If you look at Far From Home to Spider-Man No Way Home. But these all, as the charts show, are pandemic releases. So they're right up there with, honestly, Phase 1, which is kind of insane, but it is what it is. Now, the reason I wanted to start with this before I get further into the whole cultural movement type thing is because it's important to see how the Avengers films spike, but many of the other films, despite what people have told you, do not pass $1 billion. Majority have not. And if we look at the pattern here, we see that this last phase outside of the Marvels, which in this chart, it's not updated with its full box office numbers, but it's still the lowest earning right there next to the Incredible Hulk. It's something to look at and really take note of. So now that we got that out of the way, let's do the micro focus and go only talking about the Avengers 1 to Avengers Endgame. What we see there is that giant hype spike, and it starts after Avengers. And notice how other films rise with it, with the chart. After certain events film, you see a rise, and then another rise, and then another rise, and everything around it is elevated by the hype. But what people need to take note of is obviously the missing Disney Plus factor. We didn't have that back then. We did recently, and Bob Chapek's decisions sort of took away the hype, right? And now let's actually talk about the hype cycle. So it's quite clear that Avengers 1 was something, and I think many of you guys know people that are like this, who didn't really care about Marvel, but they wanted to get it on the hype because it was on the news. You know, it made it to mainstream news because this little indie company, and yes, they were an indie company when they started, was bought by Disney, and suddenly you have a film franchise that beats Star Wars. It got on everyone's radar. People jumped in and caught up with the Avengers, and suddenly, oh, I like this Iron Man. Well, guess what? Iron Man 3 is next. You like Thor? You got Thor 2. You like Captain America? You ain't seen nothing yet compared to Captain America. You like that first Avengers film? Well, we got Age of Ultron. Did it stumble a little and make less? Yes. But the follow-up, Ant-Man, almost outperforms all of Phase 1. Okay. But then you go to Civil War, and that's a giant spike. Spider-Man is here. We're building up Spider-Man, right? Black Panther. The hype just perpetually builds up. And we see it end up where it ends up. And again, this is signs of a cultural movement and a hype cycle. And how can we point to this and literally know that that's what it is? Because if you were to ask anybody in 2010, who's more popular and which one have you heard of? Justice League or Avengers? And polls were conducted before the Avengers came out. Justice League won with a 62% lead. That's how much more culturally aware the Justice League was, because you had Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman. Avengers, if you guys remember, the box office predictions for that film were an opening of maybe 50 million and a top-level box office of 650. The highest estimate was 800, but it almost doubles that. So there was definitely a shift in perception when they pulled off what the critics loved and suddenly got on everybody's radar. And it became a water cooler situation where people wanted to talk about it and watch it so they could be part of the conversation. And that all built up hype, and it ends with Endgame. And again, like the DCEU, the MCU became a thing that's attached to your personality. Suddenly, more people were Avengers fans. People were wearing those I was there t-shirts, even though they weren't there for the Incredible Hulk when it came out, or Captain America. But it was a movement. Everybody was talking about it. It was hype. It became part of people's personalities to go, well, I'm more Iron Man. Well, I'm more Captain America. Okay, who's right in Civil War? It became a water cooler conversation, just like the DCEU. So yeah, the MCU was a cultural movement that also built personalities, that also was elevated by its own hype.